This is the interesting case of the Handrail Hostilities, or to use its correct legal name, the Case of Kosoian versus the Société de Transport de Montréal, or STM, a public transit authority that operates a subway in Montreal and its surrounding metropolitan area. The case was decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2019, but the story begins a decade earlier. In 2009, Miss Bela Kosoian decided to take the subway to downtown Montreal. She entered a subway station operated by STM and started down an escalator to get to her train. Next to the escalator was a sign that displayed the words "Caution" and "Hold Handrail," and displayed a picture of a person holding the handrail. However, Miss Kosoian was busy looking in her bag to find money for her subway fare, so she wasn't holding the handrail. A police officer, Constable Fabio Comacho, happened to be on duty that day in the subway station. He was a city police officer for the municipality of Laval, but also held an appointment to act as an inspector for the subway system, in which capacity he enforced the transit authority's bylaws. When he saw Miss Kosoian on the escalator, Constable Camacho asked her to hold the handrail, because he believed that the transit authority bylaws required this. This was because the direction was displayed on the sign, and because STM had given training to the constable and other officers that holding the handrail was a legal requirement. Miss Kosoian was not willing to comply with the officer's request, and an argument between her and the officer ensued. The officer then ordered her to hold the handrail and warned that if she did not, he would give her a ticket. Miss Kosoian refused to comply with the order, as she didn't believe she had to. Once she got to the bottom of the escalator, Constable Camacho stopped Miss Kosoian and asked her to follow him to a nearby holding room, because he intended to write her a ticket. Miss Kosoian refused to follow him because she didn't believe she'd done anything wrong, and she then tried to leave. At this point, Constable Camacho and another officer physically took hold of Miss Kosoian by her arms and escorted her to the holding room, which had a surveillance camera. Once in the room, Constable Camacho asked Miss Kosoian for her ID so he could write her a ticket, but she refused and asked to speak with a lawyer. The officers then told Miss Kosoian that she was under arrest and began to search her bag to find her ID. When she objected to the search, the officers handcuffed Miss Kosoian and forced her to sit on a chair with her hands behind her back. After finding Miss Kosoian's ID in her bag, the officers then issued her with two tickets, a $100 ticket for not holding the handrail and a $320 ticket for hindering an inspector in the performance of their duties. The handcuffs were then removed, and she was permitted to leave. The day following the arrest, Miss Kosoian's husband contacted STM and filed a complaint about her treatment. He also formally requested that the video surveillance tapes of the holding room be given to him. However, STM did not respond to this request, and the tapes ended up being erased automatically after 5 days. Also, in the days following the arrest, Ms. Kosoian sought medical treatment, and it was here that a doctor diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress from the incident, as well as a sprained wrist. In 2012, Ms. Kosoian went to trial in municipal court for her two tickets. The judge decided that he was not convinced beyond reasonable doubt that she had violated a bylaw, and so Ms. Kosoian was found not guilty and the tickets were thrown out. After her tickets were thrown out at trial, Ms. Kosoian commenced a lawsuit against Constable Camacho and STM for the 2009 incident, arguing that the officer had acted unlawfully and asking for $69,000 in damages. When the suit went to trial in the Court of Quebec, the judge ruled against Ms. Kosoian, finding that the officers had been acting reasonably and lawfully. Indeed, the judge said that Ms. Kosoian was the one who had been acting unreasonably for her failure to cooperate with the officer's instructions. Ms. Kosoian appealed this decision to a higher court, the Quebec Court of Appeal, but the majority of the court, two of the three judges, also ruled against her. Among other things, the majority ruled that Constable Camacho had been acting reasonably because he believed that holding the handrail was a legal requirement, and he had been taught this in his training. Like the trial judge, they also stated that Ms. Kosoian had been unreasonable in refusing to comply with the officer's instructions. Ms. Kosoian appealed again, and the case then went to the Supreme Court of Canada. In the Supreme Court, the 9 justices unanimously agreed to overturn the decisions of the 2 lower courts. They ruled that Constable Camacho had acted unlawfully and unreasonably. They found that not all signs posted in the subway were legally enforceable, and this included the sign that directed persons to hold the escalator railings. The Supreme Court found that some signs were legally enforceable because they were based on actual bylaws, but other signs, like the one about holding the escalator railing, were only warnings, not legal requirements. The officer had misunderstood the law and had thought something was a bylaw violation when it really was not. He had given out a ticket for a bylaw violation that did not actually exist. In addition, since the officer had given out a ticket for this non-existent offense, not only was the ticket invalid, but so was the arrest. After all, Constable Camacho's purpose in arresting Miss Kosoian was to identify her so he could issue the ticket, because she had refused to cooperate and voluntarily identify herself. But if the ticket was for an offense that did not exist, well, that meant that he was arresting her for nothing, and the arrest was unlawful. Although it might have been impolite for Miss Kosoian to refuse to identify herself and to walk off when the officer was trying to write the ticket, she had no legal obligation to cooperate, since the ticket was for an offense that did not actually exist. Further, the Supreme Court ruled that just because a police officer was told that something was the law in their training, they are not always entitled to rely on that if it turns out their training was wrong. Although an officer's training can be considered when deciding whether an officer acted properly, officers are still expected to use their own judgment. In the words of the Supreme Court, quote, they must be able to exercise judgment with respect to the applicable law and cannot rely blindly on the training and instructions received, end quote. For the harm that Ms. Kosoian suffered due to her unlawful arrest, the Supreme Court awarded her $20,000 in damages.